Loneliness had a sound, and that evening it was the raw, broken rasp of a girl's voice. She stumbled into the ranch yard like a ghost spit out by the prairie, her body a fragile collection of tremors and exhaustion. Tears had carved clean streaks through the dust on her face, and when she spoke, the words were too heavy for her small frame. "I have no one in this world," she whispered to the wind. "I'm completely alone." The empty yard drank her confession, letting it hang in the air like smoke. From the porch, a man watched. His name was John, and he was a man carved from the same hard earth he worked. His boots were planted firm, his hands calloused from decades of labor and loss. The neighbors called him steady, but what they meant was unreachable. Life had hammered him down to his foundations, leaving a man who wore his solitude not like a coat, but like a second skin. Her words were a stone thrown into the still, dark well of his memory. He felt the ripple in a place he thought had long since dried up. His first instinct, sharp and certain, was to turn away. Strangers were trouble. He'd learned that lesson in blood and betrayal, and his ranch was the only fortress he had left. His cattle were his congregation, the land his only confidant. But this girl, she wasn't a threat. Not with her dress torn and clinging to her bony frame, her eyes two hollowed out pits of grief. She was the specter of a life he'd once dreamed of, a dream he'd buried deep under years of hardened mistrust. He told himself he had nothing to offer her, not a damn thing. Yet his feet moved on their own, carrying him down the creaking porch steps and into the fading twilight. He didn't say a word. Words were a currency he no longer traded in. He simply unlocked the heavy barn door and gestured with a curt nod. She slipped inside without a sound, curling into a pile of hay as if it were a feather bed. He turned his back, telling himself it was just for one night, and then she'd be gone. But when the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she was still there. She wasn't waiting for a handout or asking for another night. She was neatly folding the horse blanket he'd left for her, the simple act of tidiness, a silent form of payment. She met his gaze for a split second, and in her eyes he saw a war between defiance and surrender. He also saw an emptiness so vast it mirrored his own. He went inside and put a loaf of bread on the kitchen table. He didn't invite her in. He didn't have to. She lingered by the doorway, a shadow waiting for permission to exist. Finally, her hunger won out over her pride. She stepped inside and took the bread with both hands, her head bowed. It wasn't just food she was accepting. It was a sliver of hope she didn't dare name. He ate in silence, the quiet of the room changed by her presence. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of anticipation, like the pause between heartbeats. By midday, she was working. He hadn't asked her to. He watched from the porch as she hauled water from the well, her thin shoulders straining under the weight of the buckets. She swept the porch until the old boards shone, and then she started patching a section of fence with a clumsy, fierce determination that left her fingers raw and bleeding from splinters. She wasn't working for pay. She was working to earn her place on the planet, to drive roots into soil that had, until now, rejected her. The rancher watched, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. Her hands lacked skill, but her heart was in every movement. She worked like she was praying, offering up the last of her strength as penance for a life the world had tried to tear from her. He felt the ice around his heart begin to crack, a sensation he didn't welcome. Compassion was a weakness, a luxury he'd discarded long ago. He had no room for it. But that evening, as she fed the chickens, she started humming. It was a soft, sad tune, and the sound drifted across the yard and found him. It settled deep in his chest, an unwelcome guest in the house of his silence. He hadn't heard music of any kind on this ranch for 10 long years, not since Sarah. The sound unsettled him more than a gunshot in the night. Days bled into one another, each one the same, yet different. She rarely spoke, but her silence wasn't like his. His was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Hers was a silence that was listening, waiting, reaching for the light. With her there, the crushing loneliness of the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a fallow field, waiting for something new to grow. Then the sheriff came, Sheriff Brody rolled up in his dusty wagon, his smile as thin as a razor's edge. Brody had a way of looking at you like he was measuring you for a coffin. He tipped his hat to John, but his eyes were fixed on the girl, who froze near the water pump. "John," Brody said, his voice slick with false friendliness. "Just making my rounds. Heard some trouble over the county line. A couple of fellas looking for a runaway. Girl about her age." He gestured with his chin toward her. "Wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" John felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He looked from Brody's predatory smile to the girl's terrified face. His instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to give her up, to hand over the trouble and go back to his empty, silent peace. He opened his mouth, the lie already formed on his tongue, but then he saw the way she was clutching something at her neck, a small object on a thin chain. He'd noticed it before but hadn't paid it much mind. Now, under the sheriff's cruel gaze, she held on to it like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. And in that moment, John made a choice. "Haven't seen anyone," John said, his voice flat and hard as granite. "Just me and the cattle." Brody's eyes narrowed. He knew John was lying. John could see it in the slight curl of his lip. "Well now," Brody said slowly, "that's a shame. There's a hefty reward. A real hefty one. Keep your eyes peeled, John. You never know what might just wander onto your land." He gave the girl one last, lingering look before turning his wagon and rattling away, leaving a cloud of dust and suspicion in his wake. John didn't move until the wagon was a speck on the horizon. The air was thick with unspoken questions. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had just invited a storm to his door. He turned to the girl. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the sheriff. He saw her hand tremble as it touched the chain around her neck. What was she running from? And what in God's name had he just done? He had lied to the law for a stranger, for a ghost of a girl who hummed sad songs and worked until her hands bled. He had traded his fortress for a battlefield, and he didn't even know why. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized he didn't even know her name. That night, the sky broke open. A furious storm rolled in without warning, the clouds boiling over the mountains like a pot of black ink. Rain fell not in drops, but in sheets, hammering the tin roof of the house with a deafening roar. Thunder cracked the sky apart, and the windows rattled in their frames as if the house itself were moaning in fear. John went out to secure the barn, the wind tearing at his coat. He found her huddled in a stall, arms wrapped around her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably with each clap of thunder. Her hair was plastered to her face, and in the flickering light of his lantern, she looked even younger, even more fragile. She was a leaf in a hurricane, about to be torn to pieces. The old John, the hard man he had been just weeks ago, would have left her there. He would have told himself it wasn't his problem. Let her face the storm alone, just as he had faced his. But that man was being eroded, washed away by the quiet force of her presence. He shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The wool was warm and smelled of leather and hay. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock, a flicker of disbelief in their depths. In that moment, with the storm raging around them, a new kind of silence fell. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the thunder of his own heart. As lightning illuminated the barn in a stark, brilliant flash, he saw it again. The locket. It had fallen out from under her collar. It was a simple silver heart, tarnished by time, and it was identical to the one he had given his wife, Sarah, the day he asked her to marry him. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. Sarah had been wearing it the day she died. The stagecoach robbery. They said everything was taken. His mind reeled, the roar of the storm outside matched by the roar in his own head. Who was this girl? He reached out a hand, his fingers rough and unsteady. "The locket," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Where did you get it?" Her eyes filled with a fresh wave of terror. She scrambled backward, away from his touch, clutching the locket to her chest like a shield. "It was my mother's," she cried, her voice breaking. "It's all I have left of her." He knew she was lying. He didn't know how, but he knew. The coincidence was too great, too cruel. He saw not just a runaway girl cowering in his barn, but a ghost from his past, a mystery that threatened to tear open old wounds he thought had long since scarred over. The storm inside him had just begun, and it was far more dangerous than the one raging outside. He had to know the truth, even if it destroyed him. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. But the peace of the morning didn't reach the ranch. The air between John and the girl was thick with tension, a fragile truce hanging by a thread. He watched her from the porch, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Every move she made, every glance she stole in his direction, seemed to confirm his suspicion. She was hiding something, something big. He couldn't let it go. The image of that silver heart was seared into his mind. That night after she had retired to the barn, he did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He went up to the attic, the air thick with dust and the ghosts of memory. He found the old wooden trunk, Sarah's trunk, and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and faded perfume hit him like a physical blow. He dug past folded dresses and yellowed letters until his fingers found a small, leather-bound journal, her diary. He had never read it. It had felt like a violation of her memory. But now he had no choice. His hands trembled as he opened it to the last entry, dated the morning she had left on that fateful trip. Her familiar, looping script filled the page. John gave me the most beautiful silver locket to wear on the journey. He said it would keep me safe. I plan to put our wedding picture inside as soon as I return. I told him nothing could ever keep us apart. And I know with all my heart that is true. He slammed the diary shut, a strangled cry escaping his lips. It was the same locket. It had to be. But how did this girl, this stranger, come to possess it? The official report had been clear. A botched robbery, no survivors, all valuables stolen. The sheriff at the time, Brody's predecessor, had closed the case quickly. Too quickly, he now realized. He stormed out to the barn, the diary clutched in his hand. He found her asleep in the hay, the silver locket glinting in the moonlight that streamed through a gap in the roof. He stood over her, his shadow falling across her face. He was a man possessed, driven by a decade of unanswered questions and unhealed grief. He woke her gently, but his voice was hard. "I'm only going to ask you one more time," he said, the words low and dangerous. "Where did you get it?" He held out the diary, open to Sarah's last entry. Her eyes widened as she read the words. The color drained from her face. The lie she had told him collapsed, and the truth, or a part of it, came pouring out. Her name was Alara, and the locket hadn't belonged to her mother. It had belonged to her father. "My father," she began, her voice a choked whisper. "He was on the stagecoach that day. He wasn't one of the robbers. He was a passenger. He survived the crash, but he was hurt badly. He found the locket in the wreckage, near a woman who didn't make it. He kept it. He said it was a reminder of how close he came to death." John's world tilted on its axis. A passenger? There were no other survivors listed in the report. It was another lie. The entire investigation had been a lie. "Your father," John said, his voice shaking with a rage he could barely contain. "Where is he now?" Ilara began to sob, her small body racked with grief. "He died just a few weeks ago. The injuries he sustained that day, they never truly healed. Before he passed, he made me promise. He told me to find the man who owned this ranch. He said I had to return the locket. He said there was a great wrong that needed to be made right. But that wasn't the whole story." He could see it in her eyes. She was still holding something back. Before he could press her, a sound from outside cut through the night. The distinct sound of horses approaching, not one but several, moving fast. Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes wild with panic. "It's them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They found me." John moved to the crack in the barn door. In the moonlight he could see them. Two riders, their faces hard and shadowed under the brims of their hats. They were the men Brody had mentioned, the men who were hunting her. They dismounted, rifles in hand, and began to move toward the house. John looked from the approaching danger to the terrified girl. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was the key to the truth of what happened to his wife. And these men wanted to silence her. He had a choice. He could throw her to the wolves, let them take her, and be done with it. Or he could stand and fight for the ghost of a woman he had lost, and the sliver of truth this girl represented. He turned and looked at Alara, who was staring at him, her fate resting in his hands. In her eyes, he didn't see a liar or a thief. He saw a terrified child carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He saw a reflection of his own pain. He crossed the barn in 2 strides and took the old rifle down from its pegs on the wall. He checked the action, his movements sure and steady. The time for solitude was over. The time for questions was over. The storm hadn't passed. It had just arrived, and it had come for a fight. "Get down," he said to Alara, his voice a low growl. "And stay down." The 2 men fanned out, their movements professional and predatory. One headed for the front porch, the other circled around toward the back. They thought they were dealing with a lone man, maybe an old rancher past his prime. They were wrong. John wasn't just a rancher. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and a decade of rage was simmering just beneath the surface. A floorboard creaked on the porch. John raised his rifle, sighting down the long barrel through the barn door's crack. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He fired, the shot echoing through the silent night. The bullet splintered the wood of the porch railing, inches from the first man's head. "That's far enough," John yelled, his voice carrying a new authority. "This is private property. State your business or the next one won't miss." There was a moment of silence, then a gravelly voice cut through the darkness. "We ain't here for you, old man. We're here for the girl. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No one else needs to get hurt." The voice belonged to a tall, wiry man with a cruel slash of a mouth. John could see him now, standing just beyond the pool of light from the house. His name was Silas. John didn't know how he knew. He just did. This was the man from Alara's nightmares. "She's not here," John lied, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't play dumb. Brody told us she'd run this way. Said you were harboring her. Now I'm getting impatient. Give us the girl and the locket she's carrying." The locket? So that's what this was about. It wasn't just about silencing a witness. They wanted the locket. But why? What was so special about it? "I don't know what you're talking about," John said, stalling for time, his mind racing. "The girl's father, a thief named Marcus, was supposed to meet us after the stagecoach job 10 years ago," Silas shouted back, his voice dripping with venom. "He had the payroll box, but he never showed. Disappeared with our money and a worthless piece of silver he took off your dead wife. We want what's ours, and we want the girl, just to make sure the family line of thieves ends with her." John felt the blood drain from his face. His wife. A thief took her locket. This was the story they were telling. But Alara had said her father was a passenger. One of them was lying, and John was starting to think it wasn't the girl cowering in the hay behind him. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the other side of the yard. The second man had circled around and was firing at the barn from a different angle. The bullet tore through the wood, whizzing past John's ear. He dropped to the ground, pulling Alara down with him. They were pinned. "It's not true," Alara whispered fiercely, her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "My father wasn't a thief. He tried to stop them. Silas is the one who—" Her voice broke. "He's the one who shot her." The world narrowed to the confines of the dusty barn. The smell of gunpowder and hay filled his nostrils. The truth was here, right in front of him, and a monster named Silas was standing between him and it. He was outnumbered, outgunned. The sensible thing to do would be to surrender. But John hadn't been sensible for a very long time. He looked at Alara, at the locket that was now resting in her palm. It wasn't just a piece of silver. It was a symbol of his wife's love, and a symbol of this girl's impossible courage. "They're trying to flank us," he said, his voice calm. He crawled toward a small window at the back of the barn. "I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, I need you to run. Run to the old well near the creek. Hide there. Don't come out until it's over." "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I'm not leaving you." "That's an order," he snapped. "I don't take orders from you," she shot back. She began tearing strips from an old feed sack. "My father taught me how to load a rifle. He said you never know when you'll need to fight for what's right." She pushed a handful of cartridges toward him. "You shoot. I'll load." John stared at her for a long moment. This frail, frightened girl had a spine of steel. She wasn't running anymore. In her, he saw the same fire, the same unyielding spirit that he had first loved in Sarah. In that moment, they weren't a rancher and a runaway. They were partners. Just then, they heard another vehicle approaching. It was Sheriff Brody's wagon, rattling up the road at high speed. For a fleeting second, John felt a surge of relief. The law was here. But the relief died as soon as Brody stepped out of the wagon, shotgun in his hands. He didn't look at Silas or his man. He looked directly at the barn. "John!" "Anna," Brody yelled. "It's over. They've got you surrounded. Come on out with your hands up. Don't make this any harder than it has to be." Silas laughed again. "You hear that, old man? The law's on my side." And then John understood. Brody wasn't here to save him. Brody was part of it. He had been part of it from the beginning. The quick investigation, the missing survivor, the lie about the reward. It was all a cover-up. A 10-year-old conspiracy that had just shown its face. He was utterly and completely alone, or so he thought. He looked over at Alara. Her face was grim, her hands steady as she pushed another cartridge into the spare rifle. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but resolve. "Not alone," she said, as if reading his mind. He gave a grim nod. Maybe not. The odds were impossible. The law was corrupt. The villains were at his door. But for the first time in a decade, John had something to fight for. Not just the memory of his wife, but the future of the girl who had stumbled into his life and reminded him what it meant to be human. The standoff stretched into a tense, unbearable silence. The three men outside formed a triangle of death around the barn, their confidence growing with every passing second. They thought they had him trapped. They thought it was over. John knew he had one chance, a desperate, crazy plan that was more likely to get them both killed than save them. He looked at Alara. "The lamp oil," he whispered. "Do you see it?" She nodded, her eyes following his gaze to a large can sitting in the corner. "When I give the signal," he said, keeping his voice low, "I need you to throw that can as hard as you can toward the front of the barn. Don't think, just throw." He didn't wait for her to agree. He took a deep breath, raised his rifle, and fired 2 shots in rapid succession at the back of the house, drawing the attention of Silas's second man. As soon as the man returned fire toward the sound, John screamed, "Now!" Ilara didn't hesitate. With a strength born of desperation, she hurled the heavy can of oil. It sailed through the air in a high arc, crashing against the barn's main doors and bursting open, splashing flammable liquid all over the dry wood and hay near the entrance. Before Silas or Brody could react to the strange tactic, John fired again. This time, he didn't aim for wood. He aimed for the lantern hanging on the porch post. The bullet shattered the glass, and the flame inside fell, igniting the spilled oil. Whoosh! The front of the barn erupted in a wall of fire. The flames shot 20 feet into the air, creating a barrier of smoke and heat. Silas and Brody yelled in surprise and anger, stumbling backward from the intense blaze. It was the diversion John needed. "The back window! Go!" he yelled at Alara. He provided covering fire, shooting toward the last known position of Silas's other man. He heard a cry of pain and knew he'd hit his mark. One down. Alara scrambled through the small window at the back of the barn, smoke stinging her eyes. John was right behind her. They landed on the soft earth and ran, using the chaos and the burning barn as cover. They sprinted for the thick woods that bordered the edge of the property. But Brody was faster than he looked. He saw them. "They're getting away!" he shrieked, raising his shotgun. He fired, a spray of buckshot tearing through the air. John felt a searing pain in his left arm and stumbled. But he didn't fall. He shoved Alara ahead of him. "Keep going!" he gritted out through clenched teeth. They plunged into the darkness of the trees, the sounds of shouting and the crackle of the fire fading behind them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a rocky outcropping deep in the woods. John leaned against the cold stone, breathing heavily, the pain in his arm a dull, throbbing fire. Alara tore a strip from the bottom of her dress and began to wrap the wound, her hands surprisingly gentle. He was in on it, John said, the words tasting like ash. Brody, all this time. My father tried to tell people, Alara said, her voice quiet in the dark. He tried to tell the sheriff back then what really happened. But no one would listen. They called him a liar, a coward who ran from the robbery. He said Sheriff Brody, who was just a deputy then, threatened him, told him to keep his mouth shut and disappear if he knew what was good for him. Now the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, it was a conspiracy, orchestrated by Silas and covered up by a corrupt lawman. And his wife, Sarah, hadn't been a random victim. She had been a witness, the only witness Silas couldn't afford to let live. The payroll box, John said, his voice hoarse. Silas said your father took it. Ilara shook her head. He didn't. When the stagecoach crashed, the box broke open. My father grabbed what he could before Silas and his men could get to it. He didn't do it for greed. He did it so they couldn't have it. She reached into a small leather pouch she had tied to her belt, one he'd never noticed before. She pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. It was a single bar of solid gold. He used most of the money over the years to survive, for doctors. But he saved this. He told me to give it to you. He said it was proof. Proof that he wasn't a thief, and proof of what they stole from you. John looked from the gold bar to the girl's earnest face, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. She could have kept it. She could have run, used it to start a new life. But she hadn't. She had honored her father's last wish, walking into the lion's den to deliver a message of truth. The burning barn was a beacon in the distance, a funeral pyre for his old life of solitude. He knew Silas and Brody wouldn't give up. They would hunt them. They had to. The secret they had kept for 10 years was out. He looked at his wounded arm, at the determined girl beside him, and at the single gold bar in his hand. This was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. He wasn't just defending a runaway anymore. He was hunting for justice, and he would tear this county apart to get it. The rancher was gone. In his place was an avenger. They moved under the cover of darkness, John's knowledge of the land their only advantage. The pain in his arm was a constant, angry reminder of what was at stake. He knew they couldn't run forever. Silas and Brody would organize a posse, telling the townsfolk they were hunting dangerous fugitives. They had to turn the tables. They had to stop running and start hunting. There's an old line shack, John said, his voice low, about 5 miles north of here. My father built it. No one's been there in 30 years. Not even Brody knows about it. We can rest there, figure out our next move. They reached the shack just before dawn. It was little more than a pile of rotting logs, but it was shelter. While Alara cleaned and redressed his wound with surprising skill, John's mind was working, turning over the events of the last decade. He had been a fool, blind in his grief. He had accepted the official story, locked himself away, and let the men who murdered his wife walk free. He had let Sarah down. It wasn't just about the money, he said, thinking aloud. Sarah, she would have recognized them. Silas, his men, maybe even Brody. She grew up in this county. She knew everyone. That's why they had to kill her. She was the one loose end. My father said she was brave, Ilara whispered, her hands gentle on his arm. He said she stood up to Silas, tried to stop him. That's when he shot her. A wave of cold fury washed over John. The grief he had carried for 10 years finally had a face, a name, Silas, Brody. He would see them pay, but how? It was his word, the word of a wanted man, against a sheriff and a wealthy rancher. The proof, John said, looking at the gold bar. It's not enough. We need more. His eyes scanned the dilapidated shack. In the corner was a small cast iron stove, and behind it, wedged into a gap in the logs, was an old rust-eaten tin box. His father's box. John had forgotten all about it. He pried it loose. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was an old pistol and something else. A land deed. The deed to Silas's ranch. John stared at it, confused. This land, it belonged to my family. My grandfather lost it in a poker game to Silas's father 50 years ago. My father always said the game was rigged. Suddenly, Alara gasped. She was holding the locket, turning it over and over in her hands. There's something, a loose part. She worked at a small, almost invisible seam on the side of the silver heart. With a soft click, a false back popped open. It wasn't designed to hold a picture. It was a hiding place, and tucked inside was a tiny folded piece of paper. John took it with trembling fingers. He carefully unfolded the yellowed, brittle document. It was a confession, an IOU, written and signed by Silas's father, admitting he had cheated in the card game, and that the ranch rightfully belonged to the family of John's grandfather. And the signature was witnessed by Sheriff Brody's father. It all made sense. The conspiracy didn't start 10 years ago. It started 50 years ago. The Brody family had been helping the Silas family cover their crimes for generations. The stagecoach robbery wasn't just about a payroll. It was about silencing anyone who might uncover the original sin, the lie their entire legacy was built upon. Sarah must have found out. Maybe she confronted them, and they killed her for it. John now held the truth in his hands. The truth of his wife's murder and the truth of his family's stolen legacy. He had everything he needed to burn their world to the ground. But they were still just two people against a corrupt system. Handing this to a judge would be a death sentence. Brody would just kill them and bury the evidence. They needed a different kind of justice. They had to expose Silas and Brody to the one group of people they couldn't control, the townsfolk, the good, hard-working people who trusted their sheriff and respected Silas. There's a town festival tomorrow, John said, a plan forming in his mind. The Founders' Day picnic. Everyone will be there. The whole county. They'll be looking for us, Alara said. We'll never get close. We won't have to, John said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in a decade. We're going to bring the truth to them. The next day, the town square was bustling. The Founders' Day picnic was in full swing. Sheriff Brody stood on a makeshift stage, basking in the respect of the community. Silas was there too, playing the part of the benevolent rancher, shaking hands and smiling. They were confident. They believed they had taken care of their problem. Suddenly the church bell began to toll, loud and urgent, out of sequence. All eyes turned toward the church, and standing in the bell tower was Alara. I have something to say, she shouted, her voice amplified by the height, carrying across the entire square. Sheriff Brody is a liar, and Silas is a murderer. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Brody and Silas exchanged a panicked look. Get her down from there, Brody ordered his deputy. But before they could move, another figure emerged from the crowd. It was John. He wasn't armed. He just walked calmly toward the stage, holding up the old land deed and the confession for everyone to see. This man, John said, his voice ringing with conviction as he pointed at Brody. Help this man, he pointed at Silas. Murder my wife, Sarah, 10 years ago. They did it to cover up a lie that started 50 years ago when Silas's father stole my family's land. He told them everything. The rigged card game, the witness confession, the stagecoach robbery, the murder of his wife. He held up the gold bar. This is what they killed for. Not just money, but secrets. Silas, his face purple with rage, pulled a pistol from his coat. He's insane. He's a wanted man, spouting lies. He aimed the pistol at John. The crowd screamed, but from the bell tower, Alara had her own weapon, not a gun, a stack of papers. She began throwing them down, letting them flutter into the crowd below. They were hand-copied versions of the confession she and John had stayed up all night writing. Dozens of them. People began to pick them up, to read the words. The seed of doubt was planted. They looked from the confession in their hands to the wild, panicked look in Silas's eyes. They looked at Sheriff Brody, who was sweating and unable to meet their gaze. Silas fired, but not at John. He fired at the crowd, hoping to create chaos to cover his escape. It was his final, fatal mistake. The townsfolk who had lived alongside John for years, who knew him as a quiet, grieving but honest man, saw Silas for the monster he truly was. They surged forward, a wave of righteous anger. They disarmed him. They surrounded Brody. The lies had finally collapsed. Justice, delivered not by a corrupt lawman, but by the people, had arrived. In the aftermath, the truth came out. The state marshals came in and took Silas and Brody away in chains. The land was rightfully returned to John. The cloud that had hung over the ranch and over his life for so long finally lifted. He stood on his porch looking out at the land that was now truly his. Ilara stood beside him. The barn had been destroyed, but they would rebuild it, together. He turned to her and took the silver locket from her hand. He opened the false back and took out the tiny confession. Then he opened the main clasp. It was empty inside, just as Sarah had left it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. His wedding picture, the one Sarah had never had the chance to put inside. He carefully fitted it into the frame and snapped it shut. He handed the locket back to her. "My father said to return it to you," she said softly. John closed her fingers around it. "Your father returned the truth to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You keep it, to remember all the brave people who fought for that truth." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. The ranch yard was quiet, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace, of a new beginning. "You are not alone," he said, his voice rough. "Not anymore." She leaned her head against his good arm, and for the first time in a very long time, they both felt like they were home. If you believe in second chances and the power of truth, hit that subscribe button. You never know when you'll find a story that changes everything.